Alright, so this week we are continuing to focus on factors that promote and hinder development. We have a few more to go. We're going to start with technology. So, technology is used in almost every aspect of life. Technology does not just refer to computers and digital devices and anything that runs on a battery or has an engine or uses electricity or whatever. Technology is any kind of tool or way of doing things that allows people to do things in a faster, more efficient, or a different way. So everything from the type of irrigation that your farm uses to the buttons that are on your clothes to your shoelaces. Shoelaces are a technology. Um, all that is technology, and it is close to, not at the center, but close to the center of human history and human development throughout history. Right now, we're looking at how it promotes and hinders development in the Caribbean. So, due to the advent of globalization, we're going to go with a few key points. Due to the advent of globalization, um, technology has become more widespread in all aspects of daily life. And so the spread of technology is a natural human occurrence. Societies have technology and societies share their various technologies. Um, and again, due to the advent of globalization, the sharing of technologies becomes a lot easier, partly due to, again, more technology. Communications technology, technology that facilitates travel, um, and technology that facilitates transport of goods and transport of people. And so, because of all of that, technology has become more widespread in all aspects of daily life and also more homogeneous worldwide. Technology can promote development, such as in the area of healthcare, or as I said before, agriculture or infrastructure, all these things, allowing people to do things better, more accurately, faster. That's what technology facilitates, and so in that way, it can pretty obviously promote development. Technology is important in production processes, such as, and as a case study or as an example, the rice industry in Guyana. The technologies, the agricultural technologies, the irrigation or water management technologies, storage technologies, preservation technologies used in the rice industry will have a significant impact on the yield of the industry in any given year. And so it's very important to understand the impact that technology has on something as simple as, a society growing its staple crop. Uh, Technology may contribute to high levels of unemployment when human labor is replaced by machine labor. A few weeks ago, we talked about capital-intensive production versus labor-intensive production. And one of the things that technology does, or technologies do, is they allow, like I said, work to be done better and faster, and they allow work to be done in a way that is more efficient, which means that you can get more labor or more production, let's say, out of any individual human being's labor. So you're getting more bang for your buck, more um, production for your labor. And so technology allows, for example, production of certain goods to be done by one human being operating a machine that before, either to do that same work at that scale or at that speed would have taken multiple human beings. So a sewing machine, let's say, allows an individual human being to sew, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say to sew 100 yards of thread per 5 minutes. Before a sewing machine, it might have taken one human being 5 minutes to sew 10 yards of thread. And so The sewing machine has made the exact same amount of production, um, 10 times as efficient. And so if your business, let's say, only needs that level of production, then what you might do is you say, okay, well, we could either use 10 human beings working by hand or one human being operating a machine that allows them to do the same amount of work that we would get from the 10 human beings working by hand. And obviously, if it's only one human being and the maintenance of the machine, that's going to cost a lot less than 10 human beings that we have to pay. So we will switch to the one human being working the machine. And so in that way, technology allows work to be done more efficiently and also puts people out of jobs, as they say, contributes to high levels of unemployment when human labor is replaced by machine labor. So, benefits of technology. How does technology promote development? First point, quicker communication, obviously. Um, Second point, along those lines, quicker transactions. Next point, advances in medical care. And you can also, expand medical care to lots of other things that contribute directly to the value, the quality of human life. So agriculture and infrastructure, um, and things like surviving famines or droughts or cold winters and northern climates. All of those are technology. Uh, and efficient operation and management of businesses. That's the last point for the promotion of development. How does it hinder development? It reduces the need for manual labor. As we just saw with our sewing machine example, the sewing machine has allowed the work that was once done by 10 people to be done by one person, and so 9 people are now out of a job. Um, Small businesses can shut down due to the amount of competition. And so, as a consequence of it reducing the need for human labor, for example, let's say you had 3 garment manufacturers, everyone was working by hand, and then the sewing machine was invented. Now, you could, in theory, outfit all of these garment manufacturers with sewing machines, and they would all be producing 10 times the amount that they were producing before, per unit time or per laborer that they have to pay. But there's only so much demand for garments to be manufactured. And so what that leads to is the 3 of them will compete with price and quality, and various factors will cause them to compete because there is less demand than there is supply. And so, where before the 3 of them could coexist because the demand of the community or society was met by the 3 of them together, now only one of them is necessary to meet the demands of the society, and so they compete, and eventually one drives the other 2 out of business and supplies the demand of the entire society on their own. And so it drives the other 2 smaller businesses that could not compete with their quality or could not afford to sell things at the prices that they were selling them at. It drives those other 2 smaller businesses out of business. Um, Next, a culture of laziness and dependency. So, people used to have to walk and work themselves in order to get water. It was not piped to their homes. People used to have to, everyone was a farmer because if you wanted to eat, you had to grow and make the food yourself. So everyone was a farmer, everyone was a chef. Um, Maybe not everyone was a tailor, but there was certainly a tailor in every household because if you wanted to wear clothes, you had to make them yourself. Or let's say someone living in your household had to be making them for you. If you wanted to use tools, you had to make them yourself. But technology allows a blacksmith to supply the tools for an entire village. And so people, one, stop making their own tools, and 2, become dependent on the blacksmith. And Or, for example, now that we have a sewing machine, everyone doesn't need to have a tailor in their household in order to have clothes to wear. And so everyone becomes dependent on the tailor in the village. Um, Now that we have running piped water, people don't have to go to a well or a stream, or even a standpipe to get their water. And so they become dependent on the water authority, who operates the water pumps. Next one, disruption to business due to low internet access. That is kind of a result of dependency on technology. So there are certain things that, like this very class that I'm teaching, um, is being facilitated by modern technology, by the internet technology. And if the internet were to go out by me right now, I would not be able to teach this class. And so businesses becoming so reliant on certain technologies means that when those technologies fail, those businesses are disrupted. Um, so, for example, if you used to, this is not a realistic example, but just to demonstrate the point. If you had, a publishing company and the only way to publish books was to write them by hand, let's say, and you had a bunch of scribes writing down books by hand, copying them and publishing them, then you got electronic printers. Now your business runs on electronic printers. If the electricity goes out, you don't still have a bunch of scribes who are going to sit down and write out your books. Your business has been disrupted. Okay, that's the last point for hindrance of technology to development. As usual, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and mute your mic. Let me know. If not, we'll move on to, um, let's see. I want to do tourism first, and then global factors, because the part after this is globalization, so that will be a good transition. So, we're doing tourism now. Contributions to development and challenges or hindrances to development. Tourism has significantly contributed to the development of the Caribbean region. Um, and a lot of Caribbean economies are, to some extent or another, dependent on tourism. Um, there's a term here that the syllabus wants you to know, which is gastronomy, which is the art of choosing, cooking, and tasting good food. And it's important to the tourism industry because when people are going to have to eat wherever they go, and when people engage in tourism, they are either going to have to eat the same kind of food that they would have eaten at home, or food that a new kind of food that is the food that we eat here or wherever they are going to be tourists in. And you have to appeal certain things to certain groups of people. So, for example, tourists may not be fully acclimated to the taste of certain Caribbean dishes with their Indian or Amerindian or West African or Chinese culinary influences. And so the version of a particular dish that is served in a restaurant largely aimed at tourists or in a tourist area or next to a hotel will probably be different than the version of that food that you would find, being made at home by local residents of the Caribbean for whom this food is a part of their culture and a part of their cuisine. And so that is the importance of gastronomy, gastronomy, like astronomy with a G at the front. Um, that's the importance of gastronomy in tourism. Tourism is a major revenue earner for small island developing states. Tourism contributes to the development of the Caribbean in social, political, economic, and environmental ways. So, for example, the contributions to the Caribbean region are in employment. In Barbados, I recently heard a statistic. I don't know how much it has changed since I heard it, but I heard that in Barbados, I think it's a third of the island's jobs and 2/5 of the island's revenue are tourism, and that's a significant percentage. 33% of the island's jobs are tourism alone, and 40% of its revenue comes from tourism, and that's one industry. So it really does very significantly impact employment. Um, okay, supplies to cruise ships. Caribbean being cruise destinations means that um, we get revenue from cruises. We get sports tourism. We get ecotourism. Of course, we have leisure tourism, and we have the political and social affiliations that are facilitated by tourism. So, for example, if a lot of tourists from the UK come to, again, let's say Barbados, that's like their top tourist destination, then that opens avenues for a different kind of friendship between the governments of Barbados and the government of the UK than if that tourism were not so common from UK to Barbados. Um, we also have the political and social affiliations uh, inside the region. We have the Caribbean Tourism Organization, which is, again, a regional body associated with tourism in the entire Caribbean. And of course, foreign exchange. Tourism is a massive foreign exchange earner. People are coming from, let's say, the US and spending US money, and now we get a lot of US money from them. I have the experience of in Trinidad seeing the exchange rate for a US dollar being 6 Trinidad to 1 US in some places, and 7 Trinidad to 1 US in other places. And that's simply because some places are, and they value getting that foreign exchange so much that they will take 7 TT for 1 USD rather than 6. Because the competition for foreign exchange is fierce, and they value that um, earning that foreign exchange is um, quite high for Caribbean islands and Caribbean businesses. Okay, now the hindrances or challenges to development posed by tourism. There must be an assessment of the instances when tourism has had a negative influence on the region. Tourism may pose challenges to local society where foreign cultures and lifestyles clash with local society, local cultures, local lifestyle. The environment may come under threat as well, for example, when hotels are constructed close to the shore, when yachts or ocean liners dump oil and sewage into the ocean, when tourists dive and destroy coral reefs or destroy or impact sea turtle populations, um, or our various quite delicate ecosystems are easily disrupted by the activity of people who come to uh, enjoy and experience our ecosystems in a way that they would not do to their own, because in their own ecosystems they have to think about sustainability, but for them coming here, it's a very temporary thing, and it doesn't bear as much caution. And so the destruction of our ecosystems by tourists and the tourism industry are a massive problem, and have been in the past, and I'm sure will continue to be in the future, a problem for Caribbean territories, and not just Caribbean territories, but a lot of other small and developing states or states that have a high dependency on tourism. And there are, of course, a lot of legislations that have to be put in place to limit what tourists can and can't do, what the tourism industry, cruises, ocean liners, yachts, hoteliers, and so on can and can't do um, because of the ecological impacts. Um, The economy may become too dependent on tourism and therefore vulnerable to instability, which we saw very clearly um, at the beginning of the pandemic. And, you know, dependence on tourism is a serious problem throughout the Caribbean. Some Caribbean territories are trying to move away from it, trying to diversify, trying to, um, found their economy in more stable ventures. Other Caribbean countries or territories are kind of leaning into it and saying, this is where we get all of our money from. If this ever fails, then we really don't have a way out. And so instead of there are two approaches basically to realizing that you are extremely dependent on tourism. The first one is the best one, I would say, is to move your economic dependency from tourism onto more sustainable, more sensible industries. The second one, of course, is to just commit fully and make tourism too big to fail. Have bailouts for the tourism industry in place. Have systems to provide safety nets for the tourism industry, because you, I guess, succumb to the sunk cost fallacy and say that we're already this far in, we're already so dependent on tourism that if it fails, the problems would be catastrophic and possibly, impossible to come back from. And so we're going to do everything that we can to shore up tourism, to make sure that tourism never fails for us, to make sure that tourism never lets us down. In doing so, of course, those governments then make their countries more dependent economically and politically on tourism, which doesn't actually address the problem, because tourism is not an industry that can be so controlled from the side of the tourist destination. And for example, there are a lot of factors that are so far out of the tourist destination's control that can have significant impacts on tourism that really and truly it doesn't make any sense for them for Caribbean governments to do anything other than get out of the tourism hole that they are in. Um, I often say that we replaced the monoculture that we had in the time of slavery and colonialism, whether it was that we only grew sugarcane, let's say, and that was the entire basis of our economy. And then when the sugarcane economy was disrupted by the production of cheaper kinds of sugar, or the production of sugar in other places outside of the Caribbean, industrialization making the sugar a lot easier to produce, a lot cheaper to produce, and therefore driving um, down the exclusivity and driving down the price of sugar and driving up the demand for sugar. The Caribbean could no longer compete for sugar, and so King Sugar was dethroned. But instead of learning the lesson of sugar and that economic monoculture, we have replaced King Sugar with King Tourism, and we've done very much the same thing. We've put all of our, or not all of our eggs, but in the case of a place like Barbados, 2/5 of our eggs, that's almost half, into one basket, and it's not a particularly stable basket. Tourism, but that's the situation that we are in, and so that is the biggest challenge that tourism poses to development, which is its sustainability. It's very, very low. Its stability is low, and its sustainability is low. What's next? Right. The Caribbean Tourism Organization, or the CTO, their role is to market and manage the tourism industry in the region. And again, an organization like that exists and functions to mitigate the fundamental flaws in having an economy that is extremely dependent on an industry that is as unstable and fickle as tourism is. And so, if you want to, you can do some research into the Caribbean Tourism Organization, and what their mission is, and how they go about mitigating or attempting to mitigate the detrimental effects of tourism-dependent economy or society, and what they are doing to, make tourism as stable for the Caribbean as possible. If you are asked to write an essay about tourism, then you have a lot of material for that. Next point, or the next part in this promotes development, hinders development section. We're moving on from tourism, kind of, because we're moving on to global factors and then on to globalization. So, global factors. The global factors that affect development include but are not limited to war and insurrection and terrorism, natural disasters that affect production, um, man-made disasters, droughts affecting commodity prices, diseases, genetically modified foods, and so on. So we have a lot of global factors that really have profound and significant effects on the Caribbean. There's a saying that when the USA sneezes, the Caribbean catches the cold. And so we have to seriously examine the effects that certain global factors have on the Caribbean. Um, so a few key points. Major global issues can influence economic, political, social, and environmental dimensions of development in individual countries or territories. For example, oil prices. Oil prices are influenced by disruption in the Middle East, causing the price of products related to oil to rise and fall, um, you know, dramatically without our control. Sometimes you'll hear on the news an announcement: the price of gasoline products will go up, the price of kerosene or diesel will go up or come down or remain the same or whatever. And it's so very much out of our control. These are truly global factors. Things like natural disasters, diseases, and terrorism affect and destroy human life on a large scale. Natural disasters, great example. Um, the recent volcanic eruption, La Soufrière in St. Vincent, that had a significant impact on the infrastructure of St. Vincent. It had a migratory impact, sending lots of Vincentians for refuge to Barbados and to other Caribbean countries. Um, Diseases, or in the pandemic right now, I don't think I have to talk about the effect that COVID-19 has had on development and how it being such a global issue has had such an impact. We just talked about the impact that it had on tourism, but there are many, many more. And of course, terrorism. 9/11, the 9/11 attack in the United States of America changed airport security in the entire world. It's very different from how it looked before 9/11. Things like war, for example, the invasion of Ukraine had a serious impact on wheat production and the wheat supply for the world. Ukraine was one of the world's largest producers of wheat, and so that is another way in which that global factor has an impact on developments in our region. Okay, is that it? Right, so that's global factors. Before we move on to the globalization section of the syllabus, I'll pause a little bit for some questions. Okay, so moving on. Globalization. This is a big deal. Um, Globalization. First of all, we want definitions of globalization and forms of globalization. So, globalization describes the act of companies and organizations operating worldwide. Um, so that's basically what globalization is. Things are happening rather than on a community or society or, let's say, island or continent wide basis. Things are happening on a worldwide scale or a worldwide basis. And that seriously changes things. That is a paradigm shift, one of the biggest in human history. um, between things happening on, let's say, national or territorial scale to things happening on a global scale. Companies, for example, corporations, organizations that operate on a global scale, what that allows them to do, what that requires them to do, and the various changes that companies that operate on a global scale facilitate and necessitate are, like I said, it's a complete paradigm shift. It's totally different from how things were done before globalization was allowed to happen, thanks to the various advances in technology, and of course the philosophical changes that took place. Basically, the chain of events that was kickstarted by the 1492 voyages of Christopher Columbus into the Western Hemisphere, and the age of exploration, then the age of colonialism and slavery, and then the age of emancipation. A lot of globalization can probably be traced back philosophically, economically, politically, societally to 1492 and the beginning of the age of exploration. Let's look at some characteristics of globalization. Increases in involvement of international organizations on local or domestic affairs. For example, the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund, regulating what countries are allowed to do, how countries are allowed to do their business, how countries are allowed to spend their money. Um, it's quite funny, you know. The IMF gives loans to impoverished or small island developing states whose development was, you know, hindered and set back by the very colonialism and imperialism that the very same people behind the IMF are inheriting the means to even start the IMF from. It's a circle. They're giving us back the wealth and development that they took from us, but with a bunch of rules and stipulations on what we have to do with it, how we have to develop, um, how we have to follow their rules, or we don't get any of their money. The ability to move money and production quickly from country to country is another characteristic of globalization, and it's one of the things that facilitates globalization. So, in 1952, if you wanted to, if a Caribbean person wanted to go somewhere else, to another country, to another continent, they would have had to use sea travel. They would have had to get on a boat that was going there. Um, they would have had to wait until the boat was ready to leave. They would have to carry as much as they could carry on a boat. They would have to. It was a long journey, a long voyage. It's not a particularly fun voyage. It's sea travel. There are various things to contend with. Nowadays, you can get on a plane. I can be on a different island in an hour or less. Um, your bags go separately. You don't have to carry them with you. You are fed and provided for. The advances in travel technology and transport technology, the ability to move money and production, goods and services, and of course human beings quickly from country to country has really facilitated what globalization is today. Increases in trade without barriers, also known as trade libertization. So that's trade libertization, Libertis. Sorry, libertization. Oh, liberalization. Okay, never mind. Trade liberalization. Liberal, Liberalisation. Um, so trade, of course, used to be only facilitated through certain means, and because of the technologies that have allowed for globalization, um, trade can now take a lot more forms and, like it says, have a lot less barriers, have a lot less boundaries to international trade. And so that trade liberalization is a key characteristic of globalization. The proliferation of new and more open modes of communication. Wireless communication has completely changed the way that it is possible for people to do anything. As an example, there's lots and lots of undersea cable laid to facilitate the internet, and lots of towers and satellites built on Earth and shot up into space to facilitate satellite and GPS and internet and all of that. Um, this session's about to end, so let me just close it and reopen it real quick. Alors, bienvenue. Okay, so where are we? Yes. Right, so that's trade liberalization, proliferation of new and more open modes of communication. Interdependence, in which the world operates as one global marketplace. You may have heard some politicians talking of global citizenship or being a good global citizen. And as I previously mentioned, with, for example, the invasion of Ukraine, and Ukraine being one of the world's foremost suppliers and producers and suppliers of wheat. Um, there are certain things that make the world more interdependent rather than individual countries or societies being individually dependent. So, um, like with the wheat thing, what you used to have is in certain places you grow certain staple crops based on what grows where you are and what grows best where you are, and that's what you would eat. And so various regions on Earth had their like signature staple crops. So Africa has a lot. Africa has barley. Africa has tough. Africa has it's quite diverse in terms of its climatology, and so Africa has a few staple crops. But let's say Africa has barley. Um, in Asia has rice. Europe has wheat, and the Americas have maize or corn. And so, everybody needs these like staple carbohydrate crops. And so in like rice was the Asian equivalent to bread in Europe and um, wheat bread in Europe and corn bread, let's say, or just generally corn in um, the Americas, or bread made of not necessarily wheat, but maybe another kind of flour made of barley or teff or wherever in Africa. Um, and things would have been done like that, individually, independently, for a particular region or country or nation or whatever. But now the whole world eats wheat. Um, there are a lot of places, of course, Asia still eats a lot of rice, and in the Americas, depending on how impacted a place has been by colonialism, they still use corn and corn flour. Africa uses maize a lot. Africa uses barley and so on for their staples. But the whole world eats a lot more wheat than they would have pre-globalization. And so um, an invasion in a place like the Ukraine, or any sort of disruption in a place like Ukraine, disruption of production, means that rather than growing all of its own staple crops, let's say, um, a given South American country was eating a lot of Ukraine's wheat. And now that Ukraine can produce less wheat, and this country isn't exactly producing a lot of its own staple crop, or as much as it would have before, that impacts how much carbohydrates this given South American country can eat. That's just an example of the way in which interdependence is facilitated by globalization, and what it is and how it impacts individual countries and the world. Right. Okay. So two key terms that we've actually covered before, but we'll just mention them again for the sake of thoroughness: dumping and monopoly. So dumping is selling a product to a foreign country for less than either the price of the domestic country or the cost of making the product. As we talked about before, the aim of dumping is to flood a domestic economy with a particular product, make it uncompetitive in that local economy, drive local producers out of business, and then have a monopoly. Second key term, being a single provider or producer or seller of a product or a service. And having a monopoly in that local society then means that you can do whatever you want with your prices, because nobody else is going to drive you out of business. Nobody else even provides a thing. So let's say, I used the example of potatoes last time. Um, if a certain country no longer grows its own potatoes because its market has been flooded by cheaper potatoes produced from in a foreign market, then the potato farmers in that local economy, it's no longer productive or no longer profitable, I should say, for them to produce their own potatoes. And now there's only one potato provider, and it's this foreign country or foreign company. And now that nobody else produces potatoes but them, if anyone in this country wants to, yes, dumping. Um, if anyone in this domestic market wants to eat potatoes, they have to eat the farm potatoes or no potatoes. And the foreign company can price these potatoes however they want because, again, there's no one else producing them. And so dumping and monopoly are quite closely linked. One is generally a tactic to facilitate the other. Globalization. Right, so the nature and impact of. Oh, no, no, no. Sorry. One more key point, which is that um, globalization is considered to tie in with the political, economic, social, and technological changes within societies and tends to focus on free trade and elements of capitalism. So, globalization, philosophically, is an extension of the philosophy of capitalism. The idea of free trade and free market being virtues and values that should be striven for in a society. Um, if by your philosophy you say that whoever can produce the most should be allowed to do whatever they want with their pricing, for example, the market should decide things, then by that logic, by that principle, you will inevitably run out of capitalism to do domestically and start doing capitalism internationally. And international capitalism, taken to its logical extreme, results in globalization. So you have monopolies of, a few companies based in a few countries controlling or basically being responsible for an entire worldwide industry, or like 20 companies basically owning all food, or like a few companies basically producing all of the world's digital technology. um, all of these are the ways in which globalization is an extension of capitalism, both economically and philosophically. Right, so structural adjustment policies. We talked about this a little bit before. Structural adjustment policies or structural adjustment programs are Um, to sum it up, how the IMF tells developing countries that they have to spend the money that they are loaning them. Um, so we're going to give you a bunch of money, but you have to structure your economy in this way. You have to import a certain amount. You can't export a certain amount. You have to build certain infrastructure. You have to fund certain programs and certain communities. And that's what the IMF does when they loan developing nations money. There must be an exploration and explanation of the way in which different political ideologies may facilitate globalization. We talked about capitalism already, and how the principle that a free market is a virtue and a value that should be striven for, leads almost inevitably, with enough power and taken to its logical extreme, to globalization. And as an exercise, I said exercise to the reader, but exercise to the listener, it would be fun to take a similar look at socialism or Marxism or communism, and how that political ideology could or could not, would or would not, and has or has not, in various examples you can find. facilitated globalization in its own way. Has it or has it not? Um, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it would be a good exercise for the reader. It would be probably something that you could be asked to write an essay on, and in which case it would be very useful to have at least prepared some thoughts or some reading or some research on that topic. Um, we've talked about cultural accommodation and cultural hybridization in the past. These are some elements of globalization. Um, we also want to talk about arbitration and this word block, BLOC. First off, arbitration. Um, so, arbitration, just the word arbitration means like, well, it says here, it's a form of dispute resolution that resolves disputes outside of judiciary courts. Um, Arbitration just means making decisions on disputes or like saying how things should be done. Um, it's like refereeing. In for example French, the refereeing is called l'arbitrage or the arbitration. Arbitration just means um, saying how things should be done, interpreting the rules, applying the rules and the penalties, and so on. And arbitration is affected by globalization because if you have international bodies with international policies on how things should be done, individual companies have to comply with them. Not that these international organizations have particular jurisdiction in these individual countries judicially or legally speaking. But of course, there are ways of enforcing and implementing the will of a global organization or an international organization on an individual company with economic and political sanctions, with military action if need be. And so, arbitration and global arbitration, the means by which disputes are resolved and rules are enforced and implemented and policies are implemented worldwide, is itself a very important aspect of globalization. And next key term is block, BLOC. What is a block? Block is a combination of this is Merriam-Webster's definition. A block is a combination of persons, groups, or nations forming a unit with a common interest or purpose. For example, a block of voters, or a group of nations united by a treaty or an agreement for mutual support or joint action. I don't know if you've heard by the some like initiatives, for example, to be carbon neutral by the year 2030 or completely powered by green or renewable energy by the year 2050. There are various different treaties that nations or even just multinational corporations will sign and agree to, and so they will form a bloc. And there are various blocs. So you have NATO, for example. Um, what does NATO even stand for? NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as the North Atlantic Alliance. It's an intergovernmental military alliance between 30 member states, 28 European and 2 North American. Um, so they are an organization, an intergovernmental military alliance specifically. Um, and they are a block of countries where the gist of it is, if you go to war with one of us, you have declared war on all of us, and all of us will combine our military power in whatever military defense purposes we have. There are other blocks as well, not so large and not so, um, military layers. There's a proposed alliance called CANZUK, CANZUK, which is a proposed alliance comprising Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Um, it's part of an intergovernmental organization or confederation that is, again, proposed, and it aims to achieve the free movement of citizens, free trade agreements, and foreign policy between these particular countries. Um, you know, we also have CARICOM, CSME as regional blocks in the Caribbean, which have similar purposes to, like, Cans Up, for example. So that's just what a bloc is. It's a bunch of countries coming together and agreeing on a specific purpose. Um, Either, let's say, we want our people to be able to travel between these countries easier, or we want trade between our countries to be easier, or we promise to have each other's backs in any military crisis, so on and so forth. Um, Regional integration is here in my notes. I'm just wondering how much regional integration we're going to look into later, because if we are, then I won't start now. Okay, suppose not. Then we'll just briefly look at regional integration. Integration seeks to strengthen relationships among members of a body, in this case a region, and to deepen economic ties through trade. I talked about CARICOM and the CSME. The history of the regional integration of the Caribbean is very interesting. You always have to go back to the BWIF, the British West Indies Federation. Fascinating history, fascinating organization. Long and short of it is, the British West Indies Federation was an administrative convenience on behalf of the British government, or on the part of the British government. They had a bunch of colonies in the West Indies, the Caribbean, and they wanted administration of those colonies to be easier, because administrating them individually was a lot of work and very complex, and they figured they could just streamline the process. And so they federated 10 of their colonies in the West Indies. Um, why did it break up? Well, the Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago were doing, pulling more than their fair share in terms of the burdens and the requirements of keeping the federation going. And so Jamaica said, yeah, we're doing the most work and getting the least out of this. We're carrying a bunch of these smaller countries, and we don't need this. We'd be better off on our own. And so they left. And famously, Dr. Art Williams, the premier of Trinidad, said, well, 1 from 10 leaves none. If it's not all of us, it's none of us. And so Trinidad left, and the federation was effectively disbanded. The other 8 tried again. They called the Little Eight. They tried to be their own smaller federation, and eventually that developed into CARIFTA, the Caribbean Free Trade Area, and eventually we got the Caribbean Single Market and Economy, CSME, and the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. And so regional integration went from an administrative convenience on the part of the British government in order to better administrate its colonies to a movement of Caribbean nations and governments to attempt to strengthen um, relationships between individual Caribbean territories and to, in general, improve the condition of the Caribbean. Any questions before we end for today? All right, that's good. We're making good progress. Next week, we look at African Caribbean thought. So this is going to get a little bit philosophical, nothing too heavy. We're going to look at Pan-Africanism, negritude, Rastafarianism, and then of course we're going to continue looking at regional integration. African Caribbean thought is just like a foundational aspect of regional integration that the syllabus wants you to be acquainted with. But we're going to continue looking at regional integration after African Caribbean thought, and we're going to look at the contribution of various factors to regional integration. So I think that's almost the end of the syllabus. So we're going to look at, as I said, contribution of various factors to regional integration. Then we're going to look at, I think it's responses to globalization. Okay, yeah, something like that. Achievements and challenges in Caribbean organizations. Yeah, it just looks economic and political thought as well. That's going to be an important one. But yeah, we're almost there. You're almost there. Thank you for your time. God willing, we'll see each other next week.
Yeah, see you, sir.